Four airline crew members step off a routine flight and disappear into the rain-soaked wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, written off as a tragic hiking accident when the storm erases every trace. For 24 years, their families are left with nothing but silence and a story that never quite fits. Then, during a highway expansion, a backhoe strikes something buried deep in the earth. 4 sets of remains, lined up with eerie precision, arms crossed like someone posed them on purpose, and on the decayed fabric, a single airline pin still clinging to the past. In that moment, the accident story collapses, and investigators realize the truth is worse. This wasn't nature. It was a deliberate vanishing, and whoever did it wanted the world to believe the forest was to blame. If you enjoy unraveling mysteries that have haunted communities for decades, subscribe and hit the notification bell. The rain fell in sheets across the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, the kind of relentless downpour that turned hiking trails into muddy rivers and obscured the dense forest in a curtain of gray. It was the type of weather that made search and rescue operations nearly impossible, the type that erased evidence and swallowed secrets whole. On October 14, 2001, 4 members of Pacific Northwest Airlines Flight 447 failed to return from what should have been a simple afternoon hike. Captain Marcus Chen, 38, and First Officer Lauren Hayes, 31, along with flight attendants Sophie Kim, 29, and James Thornton, 27, had landed their Seattle to Portland route just after noon. They had a 36-hour layover in Portland, and like many crew members who regularly flew this route, they'd planned to spend the afternoon exploring the trails near Multnomah Falls. They checked into the Columbia Gorge Hotel at 1:15 p.m. By 2:30 p.m., according to security footage, all 4 had changed into hiking gear and driven away in Marcus's rental SUV. They were last seen at the Multnomah Falls trailhead parking area at 3 p.m. by a park ranger who recognized their airline uniforms peeking out from their partially zipped backpacks. They never checked out of their hotel. They never returned the rental car. They never reported for their scheduled flight the next afternoon. Within 48 hours, a massive search operation was underway. Within a week, Marcus's rental SUV was found abandoned at a remote trailhead 15 miles from Multnomah Falls. The doors unlocked, their personal belongings still inside. Within a month, the official conclusion was reached. Tragic accident. Most likely a fall from one of the area's many cliff edges, bodies swept away by the raging waters of the Columbia River Gorge, never to be recovered. The case file gathered dust for 24 years. 4 families never received closure. 4 seats on Flight 447 were filled by new crew members who never knew their predecessors. 4 names became a cautionary tale whispered among airline employees about the dangers of unfamiliar terrain, until a backhoe operator working on a new highway expansion project struck something that wasn't rock or root, something that would force investigators to reopen a case they thought they understood, something that proved those 4 people hadn't died in any accident at all. Detective Sarah Hartley stood at the edge of the construction site, her boots sinking slightly into the mud as she surveyed the scene before her. The rain had finally stopped after 3 days of constant downpour, leaving behind a gray morning sky and the smell of wet earth. Around her, construction equipment sat idle, their operators gathered in small clusters near their vehicles, smoking cigarettes and speaking in hushed tones. Yellow police tape cordoned off a section of freshly excavated ground, and the medical examiner's van was parked at an angle that suggested a hurried arrival. At 42, Sarah had spent the last 18 years with the Portland Police Bureau, the last 7 in the cold case unit. She'd seen her share of remains discovered during construction projects, but something about this call had made her stomach tighten even before she'd arrived. The dispatcher's voice had carried an unusual tension when relaying the details. Not just human remains, multiple sets, arranged in a way that suggested intent. Detective Hartley? A uniformed officer approached, his face pale despite years on the job. "Dr. Morrison is ready for you." Sarah nodded, pulling on latex gloves as she ducked under the police tape. The excavation site was a gash in the earth, about 30 feet long and 12 feet deep, part of the groundwork for a new highway off-ramp that would connect Interstate 84 to the expanding suburbs east of Portland. But it was a smaller area, carefully sectioned off with stakes and string, that drew her attention. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the medical examiner, knelt at the edge of a carefully exposed section of earth, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, her expression grave. She looked up as Sarah approached, and something in her eyes made Sarah's pulse quicken. "Sarah," Patricia said, her voice carrying the weight of discovery, "you need to see this before we extract them." Sarah crouched beside her, peering into the excavated area. What she saw made her breath catch. 4 skeletons, arranged in a precise line, each lying on their backs with their arms crossed over their chests. The bones were stained brown from decades in the earth, but their positioning was unmistakable. This was not a random burial. This was deliberate. "How long?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Preliminary assessment based on decomposition and soil analysis. 20 to 25 years, Patricia replied. "But that's not what you need to focus on right now." Patricia carefully brushed away some soil near one of the skulls, revealing a small metal pin still attached to decomposed fabric. Sarah leaned closer, her heart beginning to race as she recognized the distinctive design. Pacific Northwest Airlines. The wing's logo was unmistakable, even after 2 decades underground. "Jesus," Sarah breathed. "There's more," Patricia said grimly. She moved to the second skeleton, revealing another airline pin, then the third, then the fourth. 4 sets of remains, 4 airline pins, and Sarah, look at their skulls. Sarah forced herself to examine what she'd been avoiding. Each skull showed evidence of trauma. Not the kind caused by a fall or natural disaster. The kind caused by deliberate, violent force. Fractures radiating from impact points. Damage consistent with being struck repeatedly. "They were murdered," Sarah said, the words feeling heavy in the morning air. "Without question," Patricia confirmed. "And based on the positioning, the care taken in their burial, whoever did this wanted them found eventually. Or at least, wanted them to rest in a specific way." Sarah stood, her mind already racing through possibilities. 4 airline crew members, 4 murder victims, buried with precision in a location that had been remote forest in 2001 but was now slated for development. Someone had known this land would eventually be disturbed. Or perhaps they'd simply chosen a location they thought would remain undisturbed forever. "I need to make a call," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "We might have just found the crew of Flight 447. Patricia's eyes widened. "The Multnomah Falls disappearance? That was ruled an accident." "It was ruled an accident because we never found bodies," Sarah corrected. "Now we have bodies. And now we have a murder investigation." As she dialed the number for her lieutenant, Sarah's gaze drifted across the construction site to the dense forest beyond. Somewhere in those trees, 24 years ago, 4 people had taken their last breaths. Someone had killed them, buried them, and returned to their normal life while 4 families had spent more than 2 decades believing their loved ones had simply been claimed by nature's cruelty. That someone had walked free all this time, perhaps believing they'd committed the perfect crime. Sarah had built her career on giving voices to the dead, on bringing closure to families who'd learned to live with permanent holes in their hearts. This case, with its careful burial and airline pins left like calling cards, felt different. It felt personal in a way she couldn't quite articulate, as if the victims themselves had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to finally tell their true story. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez answered on the second ring, and Sarah took a breath before speaking. "Marcus, we need to reopen the Flight 447 case," she said. and we need to do it now. The Pacific Northwest Airlines headquarters occupied a glass and steel building near Portland International Airport, a monument to modern aviation that felt almost sterile in its efficiency. Sarah had called ahead, and by the time she arrived that afternoon, the company's legal team and head of security were waiting in a conference room on the executive floor. Through the large windows, she could see planes taking off and landing, their paths so routine they seemed almost mechanical. Thomas Vance, head of corporate security, was a former FBI agent who carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who'd never quite left law enforcement. His handshake was firm, his eyes assessing as they met Sarah's. "Detective Hartley," he said, gesturing to a seat at the polished conference table. "I have to admit, when you said you wanted to discuss the 2001 disappearance, I thought it was some kind of anniversary inquiry. We never expected—" "4 bodies," Sarah finished for him. "Buried deliberately, murdered." The room fell into heavy silence. Beside Vance sat Jennifer Liu, the company's chief legal counsel, her expression carefully neutral, but her hands gripping a pen tightly enough that her knuckles had gone white. "What do you need from us?" Jennifer asked, her voice professional but strained. Sarah pulled out a folder, laying several photographs on the table. Crime scene images, careful shots that showed the airline pins without revealing the full horror of what had been discovered. "I need everything you have on Marcus Chen, Lauren Hayes, Sophie Kim, and James Thornton. Personnel files, flight records, any disciplinary actions, relationships with other employees. And I need to know if there were any problems on Flight 447 that day. Any incidents, complaints, unusual passengers." Vance was already making notes. "The flight records will be in archives, but we can retrieve them. As for personnel files, I'll need to have legal review what we can release without a warrant." "I can have a warrant within 2 hours," Sarah said evenly. "But we both know it'll go faster if we cooperate voluntarily. 4 of your employees were murdered. Their families deserve answers." Jennifer exchanged a glance with Vance before nodding slowly. "We'll cooperate fully, Detective. But I need to be clear about something. The investigation in 2001 found no evidence of foul play. Pacific Northwest Airlines had no reason to believe anything other than what the police concluded, that this was a tragic accident." "I'm not here to assign blame to the airline," Sarah assured her. "I'm here because somewhere in your records, there might be a detail that explains why these 4 people were targeted. Were they friends? Did they regularly fly together? Was this a random crime of opportunity, or did someone specifically choose them?" Vance stood, moving to a laptop at the end of the table. "Give me a moment. I have basic personnel information in our system." His fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up files that appeared on the large screen mounted on the wall. 4 faces materialized, frozen in time from their employee photos taken in the late 1990s. Marcus Chen stared out from his photo with quiet confidence, his captain's uniform crisp, his expression serious but kind. Lauren Hayes' smile was genuine, reaching her eyes in a way that suggested she'd loved flying. Sophie Kim's dark eyes held an intensity that Sarah recognized in herself, the look of someone who noticed details. James Thornton appeared younger than his 27 years, boyish and enthusiastic. "Marcus had been with us for 12 years, Vance said, reading from the files. "Excellent record, never a single incident report. Lauren was in her 5th year, fast-tracked for captain training. Sophie had been flying for 7 years, multiple commendations for her handling of medical emergencies. James was our newest, only 2 years with the company, but his performance reviews were exemplary." "Were they close?" Sarah asked. "Did they request to fly together?" Vance shook his head. "Crew scheduling is randomized for fairness and safety. They would have flown together occasionally based on routes and availability, but there's no indication they specifically requested to work together. Looking at their schedules, this appears to be only their 3rd or 4th time on the same flight." Sarah made notes, her mind working through possibilities. 4 people who barely knew each other, brought together by random scheduling. murdered during a layover. Either the killer had been waiting for any opportunity, or something had happened that day that had made them targets. "What about the passengers on Flight 447? Sarah asked. "I'll need that manifest." "Already pulling it," Vance replied, typing rapidly. "We had 147 passengers that day. Full flight, routine service. No incidents reported, no complaints filed." Jennifer leaned forward. "Detective, do you think one of our passengers did this?" "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that 4 people left your aircraft alive and ended up buried in the forest with their skulls fractured. Someone met them on that trail, or followed them there, or was waiting for them. And that someone knew enough about their movements to execute this perfectly." She paused, studying the faces on the screen. "Tell me about the investigation in 2001. Who handled it from your end?" "Richard Sutherland," Vance said, his expression darkening slightly. "He was head of security before me. Retired in 2015, moved to Arizona. Is he still alive? As far as I know." "I'll need his contact information," Sarah said. "And I'll need to speak with anyone who knew these 4 crew members. Friends, family, colleagues who've stayed with the company." Vance nodded, but something in his expression gave Sarah pause. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated, glancing at Jennifer before responding. "There was something. Nothing that seemed relevant at the time, but now—" He pulled up another file, older, the formatting suggesting it had been scanned from paper records. 3 months before the disappearance, we had an incident. A passenger became aggressive during a flight, had to be restrained. He made threats against the crew, said they'd all pay for humiliating him. Sarah's pulse quickened. Was he on Flight 447? "No," Vance said. "But the crew he threatened included Marcus Chen and Sophie Kim. Different flight, different route. The passenger was banned from flying with us, reported to the FAA. His name was Blake Morrison." The room went silent as Sarah processed this information. "Do you know where Blake Morrison is now?" Vance's expression was grim. "That's the thing, Detective. According to our records, Blake Morrison died in a car accident in 2003, 2 years after the disappearance." Sarah stared at the screen, at the faces of 4 people who'd been dead for 24 years, at the name of a man who'd threatened them and then conveniently died himself. Convenient deaths and buried secrets. The case was already becoming more complicated than she'd anticipated. Layers of deception and coincidence that didn't feel coincidental at all. "I want everything you have on Blake Morrison," Sarah said. "Every complaint, every interaction, every flight he ever took with this airline. And I want to know exactly how he died." The Morrison file arrived on Sarah's desk the following morning in a thick manila envelope. Its contents a testament to a man who'd made himself memorable for all the wrong reasons. Blake Morrison had flown with Pacific Northwest Airlines 17 times between 1999 and 2001, and nearly half of those flights had resulted in some form of complaint. Sarah spread the incident reports across her desk, reading through them with growing unease. May 2000. Morrison became belligerent when asked to turn off his laptop during takeoff, called the flight attendant an offensive name. August 2000. Morrison consumed too much alcohol during a flight, made inappropriate comments to female passengers. January 2001. Morrison accused crew members of deliberately losing his luggage, threatened legal action in language that crossed from angry into menacing. But it was the March 2001 incident that made Sarah's skin crawl. Morrison had been flying from Portland to Seattle when he became convinced that the crew was conspiring against him. According to the report filed by Captain Marcus Chen, Morrison had stood in the aisle mid-flight, shouting that they were all in on it together, that they were watching him and reporting back. When Sophie Kim attempted to calm him, he'd grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave bruises, screaming that she'd pay for this, they'd all pay for this. It had taken 3 passengers and First Officer Lauren Hayes to restrain him until the plane landed, where airport police had been waiting. Morrison was arrested, charged with interfering with a flight crew, and subsequently banned from the airline. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court noted paranoid tendencies and persecution complex, but ultimately deemed him fit for trial. He'd pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, received probation, and disappeared from Pacific Northwest Airlines records until his death. Sarah pulled up the accident report on her computer. Blake Morrison, age 34, had died on February 8, 2003, when his car went off the road during a winter storm and struck a tree in the Tillamook State Forest. He'd been alone in the vehicle. Blood alcohol level well above the legal limit. The investigating officer had noted poor weather conditions and excessive speed as contributing factors. Open and shut case of drunk driving ending in tragedy. Except Sarah didn't believe in coincidences, especially not when they involved people connected to a case this old and this buried. She picked up her phone and called Dr. Morrison at the medical examiner's office. Patricia answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent the night overseeing the careful extraction of 4 skeletons. "Sarah," Patricia said, "I was just about to call you. We've confirmed identities through dental records. It's definitely your crew. Marcus Chen, Lauren Hayes, Sophie Kim, and James Thornton." Sarah felt the weight of confirmation settle over her, even though she'd already known. Time of death? Best estimate is October 2001, consistent with their disappearance. But Sarah, there's something else. The fracture patterns on the skulls, they're all identical. Same weapon, same angle of attack, same force. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't rage or panic. This was execution. Sarah closed her eyes, picturing the scene in the forest 24 years ago. 4 people, perhaps restrained, struck down one by one with methodical precision. What kind of weapon? Something heavy, blunt, cylindrical. Baseball bat, pipe, something along those lines. The blows were delivered to the back of the head, suggesting the victims were facing away or were already incapacitated. "They were lined up," Sarah said quietly, the horror of it crystallizing in her mind. He made them line up, or he positioned them after death. "The burial suggests post-mortem arrangement," Patricia agreed. "But Sarah, there's one more thing. We found fabric remnants with the remains. All 4 were still partially clothed. And in James Thornton's jacket pocket, we found a note." Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. "What did it say?" "Just 3 words, written in pencil on a piece of paper that somehow survived. 'He's watching us.'" The words seemed to echo in Sarah's office, a message from the dead that had waited 24 years to be heard. "I'm coming down there," Sarah said. "I need to see that note." 30 minutes later, Sarah stood in the medical examiner's examination room, staring at a small, water-damaged piece of paper preserved in a clear evidence bag. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. The pencil pressed hard enough that it had nearly torn through the paper in places. "He's watching us." "Whose handwriting?" Sarah asked. "We're working on that," Patricia replied. "We've requested handwriting samples from the victim's personnel files. But based on the masculine script and the fact that it was in James Thornton's pocket, I'd guess it was his." Sarah studied the note, trying to imagine the circumstances under which it had been written. 4 crew members on a hiking trail, one of them so frightened that he'd felt compelled to write down his fear. Had they known they were being followed? Had they seen someone watching them from the trees? "He's watching us," Sarah murmured. "Not someone. He." James knew who it was. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the photographs she'd taken of Blake Morrison's file. The man staring back at her from his driver's license photo had cold eyes and a tight smile that looked more like a grimace. His incident reports painted a picture of someone unraveling, becoming increasingly paranoid and hostile. But if Morrison had killed them, who had killed Morrison? Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Thomas Vance at Pacific Northwest Airlines. "Detective Hartley," he said, his voice tight with tension. "We have a problem. I've been going through the passenger manifest from Flight 447, cross-referencing it with our current employee database. 3 passengers from that flight are now employees of this airline. One of them is a pilot." Sarah's breath caught. "Names: Captain Derek Walsh, age 52. He was a passenger in seat 14B on Flight 447. According to his employment application from 2005, he'd taken that flight for a job interview with another airline. He ended up joining us 4 years after the disappearance." Vance paused. "Detective, Derek Walsh flies the same Seattle-Portland route that Marcus Chen flew. He's been doing it for nearly 20 years. "Where is he now?" Sarah asked, already grabbing her jacket. "He landed 40 minutes ago. He's scheduled to stay at the Columbia Gorge Hotel tonight. Same hotel where the crew stayed in 2001. Sarah felt ice slide down her spine. The same route. The same hotel. A man who'd been on that plane, who'd watched those crew members, who'd become one of them. "Don't let him leave," she said. "I'm on my way." The Columbia Gorge Hotel stood majesty against the backdrop of the Columbia River, its Spanish colonial architecture unchanged since it had been built in the 1920s. Sarah had driven the hour from Portland with her mind racing, running through scenarios and possibilities that all led back to the same disturbing question. What were the odds that a passenger from Flight 447 would end up flying the exact same route as the murdered captain? Detective James Kovac from her unit met her in the parking lot, his weathered face grim in the fading afternoon light. At 55, he'd been her partner on 3 previous cold cases, and she'd learned to trust his instincts about people. "Walsh is in the hotel bar," James said as Sarah approached. Vance called ahead to the hotel manager, told him to keep Walsh occupied but not to alarm him. "He thinks we're here for a routine follow-up on the discovery." "What do we know about him?" Sarah asked, checking her weapon out of habit, though she hoped this would be nothing more than a conversation. James consulted his notes. Derek Walsh, 52 years old, divorced twice, no children. Clean record, not even a parking ticket. Been with Pacific Northwest Airlines since 2005, promoted to captain in 2012. By all accounts, he's a model employee. Colleagues describe him as quiet, professional, keeps to himself mostly. "Keeps to himself," Sarah repeated, the phrase setting off alarm bells. In her experience, people who kept to themselves often did so because they had something to hide. They entered the hotel through the main entrance, the lobby's vintage elegance a sharp contrast to the grim purpose of their visit. The bar was off to the left, a dimly lit space with dark wood paneling and leather chairs that probably hadn't changed much since 2001. A man in a pilot's uniform sat at the far end of the bar, nursing what looked like scotch, his attention on his phone. Sarah studied him as they approached. Derek Walsh had the kind of face that would be easy to forget, pleasant but unremarkable features that would blend into any crowd. But there was something in the way he held himself, a tension in his shoulders that suggested a man perpetually on guard. "Captain Walsh?" Sarah said, her voice carrying just enough authority to make him look up. His eyes met hers, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered there. Recognition? Fear. But it vanished so quickly she couldn't be sure it had been there at all. "Yes," he said, his tone polite but wary. Sarah showed her badge. "Detective Sarah Hartley, Portland Police. This is Detective James Kovac. We'd like to ask you a few questions about Flight 447 from October 2001. Walsh's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed his grip tighten almost imperceptibly on his glass. "That was a long time ago," he said carefully. "I heard they found the crew. Terrible tragedy." "May we sit?" Sarah asked, not waiting for an answer as she pulled out a chair across from him. James positioned himself with a clear view of the exits, a subtle move Walsh's eyes tracked. "I'm not sure what I can tell you," Walsh said, his voice measured. I was just a passenger on that flight. I barely noticed the crew, to be honest. I was nervous about the job interview I was flying to. But you remember being on that flight specifically, Sarah noted. Most people wouldn't recall a routine flight from 24 years ago. Walsh took a slow sip of his drink. When 4 people vanish and it's all over the news, you tend to remember being on their last flight. Plus, I was interviewed back then by the police investigating their disappearance. Answered the same questions I'm sure you're going to ask me now. Sarah pulled out a small notebook, flipping to a page where she'd written key details. According to the 2001 investigation, you told police that the crew seemed normal, professional, nothing unusual about the flight or their behavior. Is that still your recollection? Yes. Did you interact with any of the crew members? Not beyond the standard service. Flight attendant brought drinks. I said thank you. That was about it. Did you notice if anyone else on the plane seemed particularly interested in the crew? Anyone who seemed to be watching them? Something shifted in Walsh's expression, a crack in his careful composure. Why would I have noticed something like that? Because according to your interview from 2001, James said, speaking for the first time, you mentioned that there was a man a few rows behind you who seemed agitated, who kept staring at the flight attendants. You told investigators he made you uncomfortable. Walsh's jaw tightened. I'd forgotten about that. Forgotten? Sarah pressed. You remembered the flight well enough to recall being nervous about an interview, but you forgot about a passenger who made you so uncomfortable you reported him to police. It was 24 years ago, Detective, Walsh said, his voice cooling. My memory isn't perfect. Sarah leaned forward slightly, watching his eyes. The passenger you described matches the description of Blake Morrison, a man who'd previously threatened Captain Chen and flight attendant Kim, a man who'd been banned from the airline 2 months before Flight 447. But here's what's interesting, Captain Walsh. Blake Morrison wasn't on that flight. We have the manifest. He wasn't listed as a passenger. Walsh's face had gone pale. Then I must have been mistaken about what I saw. Or, Sarah said quietly, Blake Morrison snuck onto that flight under a false name. Or you saw someone who looked like him. Or you're lying about what you saw. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Which is it, Captain? For a long moment, Walsh said nothing. His eyes darted between Sarah and James, calculating, weighing his options. Finally, he set down his glass with a soft clink against the bar. I think I should speak with a lawyer before I answer any more questions. That's your right, Sarah acknowledged. But let me ask you something else. Is there a reason you chose to fly this specific route? The same route Marcus Chen flew? The same overnight stays at this hotel? Walsh stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I don't like what you're implying, Detective. I've done nothing wrong. I was a passenger on a flight 24 years ago, nothing more. If you want to question me further, you can do it through my attorney. He pulled out his wallet, threw cash on the bar, and moved toward the exit. Sarah let him go, watching as he disappeared into the lobby. James raised an eyebrow. We're letting him walk. We don't have enough to hold him, Sarah said, but we're going to know everything about Derek Walsh by tomorrow morning. Where he was on October 14th, 2001 after that flight landed. Who he talked to, where he went, what he did. She stood, her mind already racing through next steps. And we're going to find out why a man who witnessed a flight with a murdered crew decided to spend the next 20 years following in their footsteps. As they left the bar, Sarah couldn't shake the image of Walsh's face when she'd mentioned Blake Morrison. It wasn't surprise she'd seen there. It was recognition. Walsh knew something about Morrison, something he wasn't telling. And in Sarah's experience, people who kept secrets about murder victims were usually keeping secrets about murder. Sarah spent that night in a cramped office at the Portland Police Bureau, surrounded by file boxes that smelled of dust and old paper. The original investigation into the Flight 447 disappearance had been thorough in its assumptions, but narrow in its scope. Once the rental SUV had been found abandoned and the weather had turned violent, The working theory had solidified into tragic accident, and the investigative energy had followed that path like water flowing downhill. But buried in the supplementary reports, the interviews with passengers and hotel staff, the timeline reconstructions, were details that painted a different picture if you knew what to look for. Sarah had learned long ago that the truth often hid in the margins of official narratives, in the observations dismissed as irrelevant, in the statements that didn't quite fit the accepted story. She found it at 2:17 a.m., in a witness statement taken from a hotel housekeeper named Maria Gonzalez. Maria had been cleaning rooms on the 3rd floor of the Columbia Gorge Hotel on October 14, 2001, the day the crew disappeared. She'd told investigators that she'd seen the 4 crew members leave around 2:30 p.m., dressed for hiking, laughing together as they headed to the parking lot. Nothing unusual about that. But then she'd mentioned something else, something that had been noted but never followed up on. There was a man watching them from his car, Maria had said. He sat there for maybe 10 minutes after they left, just watching the direction they'd gone. I remember thinking it was strange because he looked angry, like he was waiting for something. The investigating officer had asked if Maria could describe the man. She'd given a vague description. White male, maybe 30s or 40s, dark jacket, nothing remarkable. The officer had noted it and moved on, probably assuming it was a jealous spouse or a bored hotel guest. The description had never been connected to Blake Morrison because Morrison was supposedly banned from the airline, supposedly not a threat anymore. But what if Morrison had been watching them? What if his death 2 years later hadn't been an accident at all, but something else entirely? Sarah pulled up the accident report again, reading it with fresh eyes. Blake Morrison, driving alone, went off a mountain road during a winter storm. Blood alcohol level of 0.19. The investigating officer had found an empty vodka bottle in the car. Open and shut case. Except the officer who'd investigated Morrison's death was Richard Sutherland, the same man who'd been head of security for Pacific Northwest Airlines during the crew's disappearance. Sarah's blood went cold. Sutherland had been corporate security, not law enforcement. He had no business investigating a traffic fatality. She scrolled through the report more carefully, and there it was, buried in the notes. Richard Sutherland had been the first person on scene, had called it in, had been driving behind Morrison when the accident occurred. Her phone rang, making her jump. James Kovac's name appeared on the screen. "Please tell me you're not still at the office," he said. "I found something," Sarah replied, her voice tight with urgency. Richard Sutherland, the airline's former head of security. He was the one who found Blake Morrison's body after the car accident. He was following Morrison when it happened. James was silent for a moment. "That's one hell of a coincidence." "I don't believe in coincidences anymore," Sarah said. "I need you to help me track down Sutherland. He retired to Arizona in 2015, but I need to know exactly where. We need to talk to him before..." "Before what?" Sarah stared at the files scattered across her desk, at the faces of 4 dead crew members, at the name Blake Morrison circled in red ink. Before whoever's been covering this up for 24 years realizes we're getting close to the truth. By morning, James had located Richard Sutherland in Scottsdale, Arizona, living in a retirement community with his wife. He'd agreed to a phone interview, his voice gruff and defensive when Sarah called him at 8 a.m. Pacific time. "I remember the disappearance," Sutherland said after Sarah explained why she was calling. "Terrible thing. Those were good people, good employees. But I don't know what you think I can tell you that wasn't already in the reports." "Tell me about Blake Morrison," Sarah said. The silence that followed was telling. It lasted 3 seconds too long, long enough for Sarah to know she'd struck a nerve. "Morrison was a troubled man," Sutherland finally said. "Paranoid, aggressive. After he assaulted the crew in March, we banned him permanently. End of story." "Except it wasn't the end, was it?" Sarah pressed. Morrison died in 2003, and you were there when it happened. You were following him. Why? I wasn't following him, Sutherland said, but his voice had lost its confidence. I happened to be on the same road. It was a coincidence. Mr. Sutherland, I have 4 bodies that were buried with precision in the Cascade Forest. I have a note found in one victim's pocket that says, "He's watching us." And I have a man who threatened those victims dead in suspicious circumstances with you as the first witness. So, I'm going to ask you again, and I strongly suggest you tell me the truth. Were you following Blake Morrison? And if so, why? The sound of breathing on the other end of the line, heavy and labored. Then quietly, "I want immunity." Sarah's heart began to race. "I can't promise that without knowing what you're going to tell me, but I can promise that cooperation will be taken into account." Another long pause. When Sutherland spoke again, his voice was thick with something that might have been regret or might have been fear. Morrison didn't stop after the ban. He became obsessed with the crew, particularly with Marcus and Sophie. He'd call the airline, leave messages. Sometimes he'd show up at the airport just to watch the planes. We documented it, reported it to his probation officer, but nothing seemed to stop him. "Go on," Sarah urged. "After the crew disappeared, I knew it was him. I knew Morrison had done something, but we couldn't prove it. The police were focused on the accident theory, and without bodies, without evidence, there was nothing to connect him to their disappearance." Sutherland's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "So I took it upon myself to watch him. Followed him, documented his movements, waited for him to slip up. And on February 8th, 2003, I followed him to a bar. He got drunk, started talking to himself, paranoid, rambling about people watching him, about what he'd done in the forest. I followed him when he left. The roads were icy. The visibility was terrible. He was driving erratically, way too fast. And then what?" Sarah demanded. "He saw me following him. I know he did because he sped up, took that turn too fast. I saw his car go off the road, saw it hit that tree, and I sat there for maybe 2 minutes, detective. Just sat there and watched before I called it in. I could have tried to help him immediately. Instead, I made sure he was dead first." Sarah felt the weight of the confession settle over her. Sutherland hadn't killed Morrison directly, but he'd let him die. And in doing so, he'd eliminated the one person who could have told them what really happened on that hiking trail. "Did Morrison ever confess to you? Did he ever actually say he killed them?" "No," Sutherland admitted. "He talked about the forest, about teaching them a lesson, about making them pay. But he never said the words. And after he died, I convinced myself that justice had been served, that the families were better off believing it was an accident rather than knowing their loved ones had been murdered by a madman." Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. "Mr. Sutherland, Morrison didn't kill them." "What?" "The remains were buried with precision, positioned with care. The trauma to their skulls was methodical, professional. Blake Morrison was paranoid and aggressive. But he wasn't organized enough for this. Whoever killed those 4 people knew exactly what they were doing." Sarah paused, letting the implications sink in. "You followed the wrong man, Mr. Sutherland. The real killer has been free this entire time. Derek Walsh's apartment in Northeast Portland was exactly what Sarah expected from a man who described himself through absence. The building was nondescript, the kind of place where neighbors didn't know each other's names. The warrant had come through at noon, and by 1 p.m., Sarah and James were standing in Walsh's living room, surrounded by a life that felt more like a stage set than a home. The furniture was minimal and generic, the walls bare except for a single framed photograph of a commercial aircraft in flight. The kitchen showed signs of use, but no personality, no magnets on the refrigerator, no dishes in the sink. Nothing that suggested someone actually lived here rather than just occupying space between flights. "It's like a hotel room," James observed, opening cabinets that contained the bare minimum of dishes and of food. He's been here for what, 15 years? Looks like he moved in last week. Sarah moved through the apartment methodically, her trained eye searching for anything that didn't fit the carefully constructed neutrality. The bedroom was equally sparse, the bed made with military precision, the closet containing 3 pilot uniforms and a handful of civilian clothes arranged by color. But it was the second bedroom, converted into an office, that made Sarah's pulse quicken. The walls were covered with maps. Not decorative maps, but topographical surveys of the Columbia River Gorge, marked with pins and notations in precise handwriting. The desk held a laptop, currently closed, and several notebooks filled with what appeared to be flight logs. But tucked into the bottom drawer, underneath a stack of aviation magazines, was a box. Sarah pulled on latex gloves before lifting it out. The box was made of worn wood, the kind of container someone might use for keeping precious things. Inside, arranged with the same precision evident in the burial site, were newspaper clippings about the disappearance. Every article, every mention of the missing crew, carefully cut out and preserved. "James!" Sarah called, her voice tight. He appeared in the doorway, his eyes widening when he saw the collection. Jesus. But beneath the newspaper clippings was something else. Photographs. Not official airline photos, but candid shots taken from a distance. Marcus Chen entering the hotel. Sophie Kim laughing with other flight attendants in an airport terminal. Lauren Hayes at a coffee shop, unaware she was being photographed. James Thornton loading luggage into a car. He was stalking them, James said, his voice hard. Walsh was stalking the crew before they disappeared. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she sifted through the photographs. They were dated, written in pencil on the back. September 2001. October 2001. The most recent one was dated October 13th, 2001, the day before the crew vanished. It showed all 4 of them in the hotel lobby, checking in, captured through what must have been a window or doorway. At the bottom of the box was a small leather journal. Sarah opened it carefully, her breath catching as she read the first entry. September 15th, 2001. Saw her again today. Sophie. She doesn't remember me from the flight, but I remember her. I remember all of them. They think they're so perfect, so untouchable up there in their uniforms, but I see them for what they really are. The entries continued, growing more detailed, more obsessive. Walsh had documented their schedules, their routines, their habits. He'd learned which hotels they stayed in, which coffee shops they frequented, which hiking trails they preferred during layovers. October 10th, 2001. Marcus mentioned the Columbia Gorge to another pilot, said it was his favorite place to hike during Portland layovers. The trails are quiet this time of year, perfect for what needs to be done. Sarah flipped forward, her heart pounding, but the entry for October 14th was missing. The page had been torn out, leaving only jagged edges in the binding. He took it with him, Sarah murmured. Whatever he wrote about that day, he removed it. James was photographing everything with his phone, documenting the scene. We've got him, Sarah. This is premeditation, stalking, obsession. Combined with his presence on that flight and his choice to follow in Marcus Chen's footsteps. It's not enough, Sarah interrupted, though it killed her to admit it. It proves obsession, possibly stalking, but it doesn't prove murder. We need more. We need to know what happened on that trail. Her phone buzzed. Thomas Vance from Pacific Northwest Airlines. She answered, stepping into the hallway for better reception. Detective Hartley, Vance said, his voice urgent. I've been reviewing Derek Walsh's personnel file more carefully. His employment application from 2005 listed references, including a previous employer. I called them, and Detective Walsh lied on his application. About what? He claimed he'd been working as a regional pilot for a small airline in Montana from 2001 to 2005. But that airline has no record of him. In fact, according to the FAA, Derek Walsh didn't obtain his commercial pilot's license until 2004. He couldn't have been working as a pilot in 2001. Sarah's mind raced. Then what was he doing? What was his actual job? That's what I'm trying to figure out. But detective, there's something else. I pulled his original passenger record from Flight 447. He paid cash for that ticket, booked it the day before the flight. And the address he listed on the booking? It doesn't exist. Derek Walsh didn't take that flight for a job interview. He took it specifically to watch that crew. Sarah leaned against the wall, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. He planned it. He chose that flight, positioned himself to observe them, followed them to Portland, stalked them to the trail. Detective, Vance said quietly, I think Derek Walsh has been playing the role of a pilot for 20 years as some kind of trophy. He wanted to become what he destroyed. After ending the call, Sarah returned to the office, staring at the maps on Walsh's walls. Her eyes traced the pins and notations until she found what she was looking for. One location, marked with a red circle, deep in the forest north of Multnomah Falls. The same general area where the bodies had been discovered. But there was another mark, this one in blue, several miles away from the burial site. A notation beside it read, Morrison, February 8th, 2003. James? Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Derek Walsh was there when Blake Morrison died. He knew about the accident. James moved beside her, studying the map. How would he know unless he was involved? Sarah finished. Morrison wasn't the killer, but he must have seen something, known something. And Walsh couldn't let him live. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier with the weight of realization. They were standing in the carefully constructed life of a man who'd killed at least 5 people, who'd then spent 2 decades living as a ghost of his victims, flying their routes, staying in their hotels, walking the same paths they'd walked. Where is Walsh now? James asked. Sarah checked her phone, pulling up the alert she'd set on his location. Walsh's personal phone, which they'd been monitoring with a warrant, showed his last known position as the Columbia Gorge Hotel. But the signal had gone dead 2 hours ago. He turned off his phone, Sarah said, ice sliding through her veins. He knows we're on to him. She pulled up a different app, one that tracked commercial flights. Derek Walsh had been scheduled to fly that afternoon, a routine Seattle-Portland run. But according to the airline system, Walsh had called in sick. The first time in his entire career he'd missed a scheduled flight. Sarah stared at the map on Walsh's wall, at the red circle marking where 4 people had died, at the careful notations that suggested someone who knew every inch of that forest. He's going back, she said. He's going back to where it started. The forest was darker than Sarah remembered from her last visit to the burial site, the canopy of Douglas firs and western hemlocks filtering what remained of the afternoon light into a dim green twilight. She and James had driven directly from Walsh's apartment, calling for backup to meet them at the trailhead. But Sarah knew they couldn't wait. Walsh had hours head start, and somewhere in these woods, he was either destroying evidence or preparing to disappear forever, or preparing for something worse. They'd parked near the construction site where the bodies had been discovered, the yellow police tape still fluttering in the breeze, and followed the map from Walsh's apartment. The red circle had been marked approximately 2 miles northwest of the burial location, in an area where the maintained trails gave way to wilderness, where the forest grew thick enough to swallow secrets. Sarah's boots found purchase on the uneven ground, her hand instinctively checking her weapon every few minutes. Beside her, James moved with the careful awareness of someone who'd spent 3 decades expecting violence. The radio on his belt crackled occasionally, with updates from the backup units making their way to the location. But they were at least 20 minutes behind. There, James said quietly, pointing ahead. Through the trees, Sarah could see a structure. Not a cabin exactly, but a shelter of some kind, built from weathered wood and partially concealed by the natural landscape. As they approached cautiously, Sarah realized it had been here for years, perhaps decades, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But someone had been maintaining it, keeping it functional. The door was ajar. Sarah drew her weapon, James doing the same. They flanked the entrance, communicating with practiced hand signals before Sarah pushed the door fully open. "Portland Police! Derek Walsh, if you're inside, we need you to come out with your hands visible." Silence answered her, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of a crow. Sarah entered first, her weapon raised, her eyes adjusting to the deeper darkness inside. The shelter was a single room, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, with a dirt floor and walls that had been reinforced with newer wood. A camping lantern sat on a makeshift table, unlit. A sleeping bag lay rolled in one corner, but it was the far wall that made Sarah's blood run cold. Photographs covered nearly every inch of the rough wood surface. The 4 crew members, dozens of images, some from the collection in Walsh's apartment, but others she hadn't seen. These were more intimate, more invasive. Sophie Kim through her apartment window. Marcus Chen playing with what must have been a friend's child at a park. Lauren Hayes at a gym, captured mid-workout. James Thornton at what looked like a family dinner. And beneath the photographs, written directly on the wood in what appeared to be black marker, were words. The same words, repeated over and over in increasingly frantic handwriting. "They saw me, they saw me, they saw me." "What the hell does that mean?" James whispered. Sarah moved closer, studying the wall. Between some of the photographs were newspaper clippings, but these weren't about the disappearance. They were older, dating back to 1999. Articles about airline security, about new surveillance measures being implemented after a series of incidents, about crew members being trained to identify suspicious passengers. And then she saw it. A photograph tucked into the corner, yellowed with age. It showed a younger Derek Walsh, maybe in his late 20s, being escorted from an airport by security. The caption, partially torn but still legible, read, "Man detained for suspicious behavior at PDX, questioned and released." He was flagged, Sarah said, understanding crystallizing. Before 9/11, before security got really tight, he was already being watched. And the crew, Marcus, Sophie, Lauren, James, they were trained to identify passengers who might be threats. They saw him, they noticed him, and he couldn't let that stand. "So this was about ego?" James asked incredulously. "He killed 4 people because they were doing their jobs?" "It's never really about the reason they give," Sarah said, her voice tight. "It's about control. They saw him, really saw him, and that made him feel exposed, vulnerable. In his mind, they had to be eliminated." A sound from outside made them both freeze. Footsteps, crunching through the undergrowth, approaching the shelter. Sarah moved to the side of the door, James taking position opposite her. The footsteps stopped just outside. "I knew you'd find this place eventually." Derek Walsh's voice drifted through the open door, calm and measured. "I left enough clues. I wanted you to understand before the end." "Derek," Sarah called out, her weapon trained on the doorway. "You need to come inside with your hands where we can see them. This doesn't have to end badly." A soft laugh answered her. "Doesn't it? I've been dead since October 14th, 2001, Detective. I died with them on that trail. Everything since then has just been an echo." "You're not making sense," Sarah said, buying time, listening for the backup units that had to be getting close. "Come inside. Tell us what happened. Make us understand." "I tried to let it go," Walsh said, his voice carrying an edge of something that might have been grief or madness. "After that first time at the airport, when they looked at me like I was dangerous, like I was something to be watched and reported, I tried to move on. But then I saw them again, on that flight in October. And they looked at me the same way. Sophie especially. She watched me the entire flight, like she was memorizing my face to report me later." Sarah exchanged a glance with James. In the photographs on the wall, she could see what Walsh had seen. Crew members doing their jobs, being professional, making everyone feel safe. But in his paranoid mind, their vigilance had become persecution. I followed them to Portland, Walsh continued. Watched them at the hotel, so happy, so confident in their power over people like me. And when they went hiking, I was already there, waiting. I'd been studying those trails for weeks, knowing they'd eventually come back to their favorite spot. What happened on the trail? Sarah asked, her heart pounding. I tried to talk to them. I wanted them to understand that I wasn't dangerous, that they didn't need to fear me. But Marcus recognized me from the airport incident. He told the others to stay back, pulled out his phone to call for help. That's when I knew there was only one way this could end. The sound of vehicles in the distance, the slam of doors. Backup was arriving. Walsh must have heard it too because his voice changed, became urgent. I lined them up, detective, made them kneel facing the forest so they wouldn't see it coming. James was last. He begged me to let him write a note for his family. I allowed him that kindness, and then I gave them peace. They don't watch anyone anymore. And Blake Morrison? Sarah demanded. What about him? Morrison saw me that day. He was hiking a different trail, saw me leading them away. He tried to blackmail me later, said he'd go to the police if I didn't pay him. So I followed him until an opportunity presented itself. A icy road. A drunk driver, a tragic accident. So much simpler than what came before. Sarah's mind raced. Walsh was confessing, giving them everything they needed. But something in his tone suggested this wasn't surrender. This was something else. Richard Sutherland, Walsh said, and Sarah could hear the smile in his voice. Did you talk to him? Did he tell you about following Morrison? I watched Sutherland watching Morrison. 3 people obsessed with the same moment in time. It would have been poetic if it wasn't so pathetic. Derek, Sarah tried again. Come inside. Let's end this peacefully. You don't understand, Walsh said, his voice growing distant, as if he were backing away. I didn't come here to surrender, detective. I came here to join them. I've been living in their shadow for 24 years. Flying their routes, sleeping in their hotels, walking their paths. It's time I followed them all the way. Sarah bolted through the door, James right behind her. They emerged into the fading light to see Walsh standing at the edge of a steep ravine, the same cliff face that had been marked on his map. In his hand was a pistol. Derek, don't! Sarah shouted, moving forward slowly, her weapon lowered. Your death won't fix anything. Those families deserve to hear the truth from you, not from us. Walsh turned to face her, and in the dying light, Sarah could see tears streaming down his face. I can still see them, he said. Every time I close my eyes, kneeling in the leaves, Sophie crying, Marcus trying to stay brave for the others. I see them when I fly, when I sleep, when I wake. They never leave me alone. Then help us give their families closure, Sarah urged, taking another step closer. Tell them why. Help them understand. For a moment, Walsh seemed to waver. The gun lowered slightly, his expression crumbling into something that looked almost human. But then his gaze shifted to something behind Sarah, and his face hardened. They're all here now, he said, his voice filled with wonder. Marcus and Sophie and Lauren and James, they've been waiting for me. They forgive me. Sarah lunged forward, but she was too far away. Walsh stepped backward off the cliff's edge, the sound of his body hitting the rocks below, swallowed by the forest's eternal whisper. 6 months later, Sarah stood at the memorial that had been erected at Multnomah Falls, a simple stone marker bearing the names of Marcus Chen, Lauren Hayes, Sophie Kim, and James Thornton. The families had chosen this location not because it was where they died, but because it had been where they'd been happy, where they'd come to find beauty in the world. The investigation had concluded with Derek Walsh's death, his confession recorded and verified through the evidence found in his apartment and the shelter in the woods. The families had finally received the closure they'd sought for nearly a quarter century. though Sarah knew that closure was a word that could never fully capture the complexity of their loss. Marcus Chen's elderly mother had wept in Sarah's office when shown the photographs of her son from Walsh's collection. Not tears of grief, but tears of rage that someone had stolen so many years from her family. Lauren Hayes' sister had listened to the recording of Walsh's confession in silence, then thanked Sarah and left without another word. Sophie Kim's parents had asked only one question: did they suffer? Sarah had lied and said no, though the autopsy report suggested otherwise. James Thornton's brother had wanted to know where Walsh was buried so he could spit on the grave, but Walsh's body had been cremated without ceremony, his ashes scattered in a place no one would ever memorialize. The investigation into Richard Sutherland's role had resulted in no charges. The statute of limitations had expired, and ultimately, his crime had been inaction rather than action. He'd sent a letter to each of the families, apologizing for his failure to bring them justice sooner. Sarah didn't know if anyone had responded. Pacific Northwest Airlines had established a scholarship fund in the crew's names, supporting aviation students who demonstrated both technical excellence and commitment to passenger safety. Thomas Vance had personally ensured that the company's training programs now included comprehensive modules on identifying and reporting suspicious behavior, making something meaningful from the tragedy. The construction project where the bodies had been discovered had been rerouted. The burial site had been preserved as a protected area, marked only by a small plaque that read, "In this place, 4 souls found rest. May they never be forgotten." But it was the note found in James Thornton's pocket that haunted Sarah most. "He's watching us." 3 words that had waited 24 years to be read. A final message from a young man who'd known his death was coming but had tried anyway to leave evidence behind. In her darker moments, Sarah wondered if the note had been meant as a warning to others or simply a statement of fact, a last observation from someone who'd spent his final moments understanding that he'd been seen. She placed a bouquet of flowers at the memorial's base, 4 white roses for 4 lives cut short. Behind her, the falls thundered their eternal song, water cascading over stone just as it had the day Marcus, Lauren, Sophie, and James had stood here, alive and laughing, unaware that death was already watching them from the trees. Sarah had learned long ago that justice and closure were not the same thing. Justice was what the legal system provided: charges, trials, verdicts, sentences. Closure was something far more elusive, a door that could never quite shut completely once death had forced it open. The families would carry their losses forever, the weight perhaps lighter now that they knew the truth, but never truly gone. As she turned to leave, Sarah caught her reflection in the polished surface of the memorial stone. For a moment, she looked tired, older than her 42 years, worn down by all the death she'd witnessed in her career. But then she straightened her shoulders and walked back toward her car, carrying with her the knowledge that she'd given 4 people their voices back, had allowed them to speak from beyond the grave and name their killer. It was never enough. It would never undo what had been done, but it was something. And in the business of cold cases, of old murders and buried secrets, sometimes something was all you could hope for. The sun was setting behind the Cascade Mountains as Sarah drove back to Portland, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked almost like fire. She thought of Derek Walsh, standing at the edge of that cliff, seeing ghosts in the fading light. She thought of the 4 crew members, kneeling in the leaves, their final moments filled with terror and confusion. She thought of all the lives that had been changed by one man's paranoia and rage. And she thought of James Thornton's note, those 3 words that had survived death and decay to tell a story. He's watching us. Sarah glanced in her rearview mirror, an instinctive gesture born from years of law enforcement. The road behind her was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that had settled over her since finding Walsh's collection of photographs, since understanding the depth of his obsession. Someone was always watching, In airports and airplanes, in hotels and hiking trails, in the ordinary moments of ordinary lives, someone was always watching. Most of the time, they saw nothing more than human beings moving through their days. But sometimes, rarely, they saw something else. They saw targets. They saw threats. They saw reasons that made sense only to them. The art of investigation, Sarah had learned, was understanding that everyone was both the watcher and the watched. Derek Walsh had watched the crew, and the crew had watched him back. Richard Sutherland had watched Blake Morrison. Morrison had watched Walsh. And through it all, 4 innocent people had died simply because they'd been good at their jobs, because they'd been trained to notice what others missed. As darkness fell and the city lights of Portland appeared on the horizon, Sarah made a mental note to call Patricia Morrison in the morning. The medical examiner had mentioned finding additional evidence during the final examination of the remains, something she wanted to discuss privately. Sarah suspected it would be another piece of the puzzle, another detail that would add depth to a story she thought she already understood. Because the truth about cold cases, the truth Sarah had learned across nearly 2 decades of investigation, was that they were never truly closed. New evidence emerged, new witnesses came forward. New perspectives shed light on old shadows. The dead might be silent, but their stories continued to evolve, layer upon layer of revelation building toward something that approached but never quite reached complete understanding. Flight 447 had carried 147 passengers and 4 crew members on that October day in 2001. 147 people had walked away from that plane and continued their lives. 4 had not. And 1 passenger, Derek Walsh, had carried his obsession for 24 years before finally releasing it in confession and death. Sarah wondered about the other 146 passengers. Had any of them noticed Walsh watching the crew? Had any of them felt the undercurrent of tension that must have existed on that flight? Or had they simply been absorbed in their own lives, their own destinations, unaware that they were sharing space with a man planning murder? She would never know. Most of those passengers would never know their names had been attached to a case that would be studied in law enforcement training programs for years to come. They would never know how close they'd come to witnessing something that might have changed the course of events. As Sarah pulled into her parking space at the Portland Police Bureau, she allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. The case was solved. 4 families had answers. A killer had been stopped from claiming any more victims. In the ledger of justice, that had to count as a win. But as she gathered her belongings and locked her car, as she walked toward the building where new case files already waited on her desk, Sarah couldn't shake the image of those photographs on the Walsh's wall. The crew members, captured in moments when they thought they were alone, when they believed themselves unobserved. "He's watching us." The note had been a warning, but it was also a truth that extended beyond 1 case, beyond 4 victims. In the modern world of surveillance cameras and smartphones, of social media and digital footprints, everyone was always watching everyone. Most of that watching was benign, even protective. But sometimes, rarely, it was the prelude to violence. Sarah's job was to sort through the aftermath, to piece together the watching and the violence and the silence that followed, to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. It was heavy work, soul-crushing at times, but it was necessary work. Someone had to care about the cold cases, about the forgotten victims, about the families still waiting for answers decades after their worlds had been shattered. As she sat down at her desk and opened the first file, Sarah whispered a quiet promise to the photograph of Marcus Chen, Lauren Hayes, Sophie Kim, and James Thornton that she'd pinned to her bulletin board. "I saw you," she said, "and I made sure the world sees you too, not as victims, as people, as lives that mattered." The faces in the photograph smiled back at her, frozen in a moment before death, before terror, before everything changed. They would smile that way forever now, preserved not just in the memories of their families, but in the permanent record of justice served. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. but it was something. And sometimes, something was everything.